In June of 1954, 22 boys boarded two yellow buses in Oklahoma City and were driven into the foothills of the San Boy Mountains for what they thought was a summer camp. They were 11 and 12 years old. They had been carefully selected. They were all white, middle-class, Protestant, with two-parent homes, average to above-average school performance, and a median IQ of 112. They had never met each other. They had never met the camp counselors, and they had no idea that the camp counselors were not counselors at all. They were research assistants for a social psychologist named Muzafer Sherif, who had been given $38,000 by the Rockefeller Foundation and a single objective. He was going to take 22 ordinary, well-adjusted American boys, and he was going to engineer them into two warring tribes. He believed it would take less than 2 weeks. He believed the boys would form deep prejudices against each other, develop stereotypes, and eventually commit acts of violence that would be indistinguishable from the wars between adult nations. Then he was going to try to stop them. What happened over the next 3 weeks at Robbers Cave State Park would become one of the most cited studies in the history of social psychology. It would inspire the book Lord of the Flies, published a year later, and it would produce a finding so important about how to end human conflict that the entire field has been pointing at it for 70 years, while almost everyone outside the field continues to misremember it. Because the part of the experiment everyone remembers is the war. The part that explains how to actually end one is the part that nobody talks about. To understand what Sherif was trying to prove, you have to understand who he was. Muzafer Sherif was born in the Ottoman Empire in 1906. As a young man, he survived the Turkish genocide of Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, and watched neighbors and former friends murder each other inside the same village over identities that had not seemed to matter the year before. He came to Harvard in his 20s. He developed a theory called realistic conflict theory. The idea was simple and devastating. Sherif believed that human conflict was not driven by hatred or evil or some flaw in the worst people. He believed it was driven by competition over scarce resources. If you took any two groups of perfectly normal, well-meaning people, gave them separate identities, and forced them to compete for something they both wanted, you could produce prejudice and violence between them in days. The implication was that the murderers in his childhood village were not monsters. They were just human beings who had been placed in the wrong conditions. And if conditions were what produced conflict, then conditions could end it. He just had to prove it. His first attempt was in the summer of 1953, at a place called Middle Grove in upstate New York. The setup was almost identical to what would later happen at Robbers Cave. Boys arrived at a camp. They were split into two groups. The research team, posing as counselors, then began to engineer hostility between them. They staged thefts, they tore down tents, they smashed toys, blamed the other group, and waited for the war to start. It did not start. The boys figured out almost immediately that the counselors were the ones causing the problems. Across the two groups, friendships persisted. The boys refused to turn on each other. They turned on the adults instead. The experiment ended in a drunken argument between Sherif and his own research assistants, because reality had refused to confirm his theory. The Middle Grove study was abandoned. The data was buried. For decades, almost no one knew it had happened. Sherif still had grant money. He felt his reputation was on the line. So in the summer of 1954, he tried again. And this time, he changed the design. The boys would not meet until the groups had already been formed. They would be transported on separate buses. They would be housed in separate cabins on opposite ends of a 200-acre site. They would not know the other group existed for almost a week. This was the key change. The bonds that had saved the Middle Grove boys would not be allowed to form in the first place. The site this time was a Boy Scout camp completely surrounded by Robbers Cave State Park in southeastern Oklahoma. 11 boys arrived on the first bus. 11 more arrived on the second. Each group was given roughly a week to do nothing but bond. They hiked, they swam, they cooked, they pitched tents together. They invented group names. One group called themselves the Rattlers. The other group called themselves the Eagles. They stenciled the names onto their shirts. They composed group songs. They identified group leaders. They developed inside jokes, group rituals, and a strong shared identity. By the end of week 1, 2 coherent boy tribes existed where there had been 22 strangers 7 days earlier. Sherif had not had to do anything to create the tribes. He had only had to give the boys a week of shared activity and a name. The willingness to identify with a group, he was discovering, was not something humans had to be taught. It was something that happened automatically. You simply had to wait. In week 2, the camp staff did something the boys did not expect. They announced that there was another group of boys living at the camp, on the other side of the woods, and that the two groups were going to compete in a tournament: baseball, tug of war, tent pitching, treasure hunts. The winning team would receive trophies and medals and pocket knives. The losing team would receive nothing. The reaction was instant. The moment the boys learned that other boys existed, before the two groups had even seen each other, both sides began to refer to the other as the enemy. The Eagles started saying they hated the Rattlers. The Rattlers had not yet been introduced. When the groups finally met at the baseball diamond, the insults began before the first pitch. Within 24 hours, the camp had become a war zone. The Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The Rattlers retaliated by burning the Eagles' flag. The Rattlers raided the Eagles' cabin at night, overturning beds, dumping suitcases, and terrorizing the boys inside. The Eagles armed themselves with socks filled with rocks for the next raid. There were fistfights at meals. There was food thrown in the dining hall. There were stereotypes about the other group, which the boys did not have a week earlier, repeated with the certainty of children who had always known them. Each side believed the other side was made of cowards, cheaters, and bullies. Each side believed its own group was made of brave, fair, courageous boys. The hostility did not have to be taught. It only had to be triggered by a single, zero-sum competition for prizes. These were not damaged boys. They had been screened for being psychologically healthy, popular, middle-class, normal. And they had become, in a week, the kind of small-scale warriors that adult humans across history have been over and over and over again. This is the part of the Robbers Cave experiment everyone remembers. It is the part textbooks use. It is the part that makes the experiment famous. But it is not the part that mattered, because Sherif's actual question was not whether he could create the conflict. He already knew he could. His question was whether he could end it. So in week 3, he tried. His first attempt was the obvious one, the one almost every modern conflict resolution program still defaults to. He brought the two groups together for friendly, peaceful, non-competitive activities. They ate meals together. They watched a movie together. They lit fireworks together on the 4th of July. Sherif believed that simple contact between groups, in an absence of competition, would dissolve the hostility. It did not. It made it worse. At every shared meal, food fights broke out. At every shared activity, insults flew. The boys had been trained, in the space of a few days, to see the other group as an enemy, and putting them in the same room without giving them a reason to cooperate did nothing to change that. Mere contact, Sherif concluded, was useless. You can sit two groups of human beings across the same table and feed them the same dinner forever, and they will hate each other forever. This finding alone, by itself, would have been one of the most uncomfortable in modern social psychology. It is the part of the experiment almost nobody quotes. Most people, when they imagine how to resolve a conflict, imagine some version of getting the two sides into the same room. Sherif had just proven, with 11-year-old boys, that this does not work. So he tried something else. And what he tried is the part of the experiment that explains every political conflict alive today. He stopped trying to bring the groups together as groups. He started inventing problems that neither group could solve alone. The first one was the water. The camp's drinking water came from a reservoir in the mountains above the site. One afternoon, the staff announced that the water supply had failed. Vandals were blamed. The staff asked both groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers together, to help inspect the pipes and find the problem. 22 thirsty boys spread out across the water line. They worked together for nearly 45 minutes. They found the obstruction, a sack stuffed into the faucet at the top of the line. They cleared it. The water came back on. There was common rejoicing. That evening, another food fight broke out at dinner. The hostility had not vanished, but it had cracked. Sherif tried it again. The food truck for an off-site cookout stalled at the bottom of a hill, and the boys had to use a single rope, the same rope they had used to play tug of war against each other a week earlier, to pull it back up. Both groups pulled. The truck started. Dinner happened. Hostility cracked further. Sherif kept going. A movie they all wanted to see required pooled money from both groups. They pooled it. They watched Treasure Island together. Tents were missing supplies on the joint campout. Boys from both groups had to combine resources and work together to make shelter for the night. They did. One small problem, then another, each impossible to solve with one group alone, each requiring both groups to put down their identities for a moment and become one larger group with a single shared problem. Sherif had a name for these tasks: He called them superordinate goals. The word superordinate is the key. The goal had to be larger than either group. It had to be something that no rattler could achieve without an eagle, and no eagle could achieve without a rattler. It had to make the original group identities, for a moment, smaller than the problem in front of them. Mere contact failed because it left both group identities intact. The superordinate goals worked because they forced the formation of a third identity, a larger identity that contained both groups. By the final week of camp, the boys were sitting together at meals. They were sharing food. The group that won the final tournament prize, which was a small amount of money, voted to use the money to buy treats for both groups. On the last day of camp, when the buses arrived to take the boys home, both groups asked, together, if they could ride home on the same bus. They did. They sang the same songs. The war that had taken 3 days to build had taken about a week to undo. The mechanism was not friendliness. It was not understanding. It was not contact. It was the steady, repeated experience of a problem that could only be solved together. This is the finding that almost nobody outside academic social psychology remembers correctly. The lesson of Robbers Cave is not that humans are tribal, although they are. The lesson is not that competition produces violence, although it does. The lesson is that the only thing that has ever been shown to reliably dissolve intergroup hatred, once it is formed, is the construction of a goal that is larger than either group and impossible to achieve without both. This is why, in the history of the human species, the most reliable producer of national unity has been a foreign war, or a natural disaster, or a pandemic, anything that turns separate factions briefly into one larger group facing one larger problem. It is why political movements that build coalitions across hostile groups always do so by naming a threat or a goal that exceeds the boundaries of either group alone. It is why mere dialogue, mere debate, mere proximity has been shown over and over to fail at reducing the kinds of conflicts that fill the news cycle. The Eagles and the Rattlers did not need to be told the other group was human. They did not need lectures on diversity. They did not need to sit in a circle and share their feelings. They needed a stuck truck and a hill, and they needed to be the ones pulling it. The peace was not made of words. It was made of work. And every functioning society in human history has had to relearn this, slowly, the hard way, often after a war or a disaster has done the teaching for them. There is a darker part of this story that does not usually get told. Muzafer Sherif spent the rest of his life in an unstable mental state, drinking heavily, paranoid about colleagues, convinced that his work had been misunderstood. The boys at Robbers Cave were never told they had been part of an experiment. Several of them, decades later, when journalist Gina Perry tracked them down for her book The Lost Boys, were shocked to learn that the violent week of their childhood had not been a normal summer. They remembered being terrified. They remembered the staff watching them fight without intervening, and the failed earlier study at Middle Grove, the one where the boys had refused to turn on each other, the one where existing friendships were strong enough to defeat the entire experimental design, sat in a filing cabinet for 50 years before anyone noticed it. There is a quieter conclusion you can pull from the whole sequence. If you put both experiments side by side, it is this. Conflict between groups, even between children, takes a specific set of conditions to ignite. It needs separation. It needs strangers. It needs a zero-sum reward. When those conditions are missing, when boys arrive on the same bus and become friends before anyone tries to divide them, the war Sherif believed was inevitable never actually arrives. The first finding of Robbers Cave is that hostility is easy to engineer. The second finding is that the only thing that ends it is shared work on a problem too big for either side. And the third finding, the one Sherif buried but Gina Perry recovered, is that if you let people meet each other first, as people, before you label them, the hostility may never start at all. 3 lessons sitting in the same archive. The world remembers the first one constantly, the second one occasionally, and the third one almost never. Every conflict you can think of, in every country, in every era, is the same story repeating. 2 groups, separated. A scarce resource. A name. The fight begins. The peace, when it comes, never comes from talking. It comes from a problem larger than the fight, that neither side can solve without the other. Sherif found the formula in a summer camp in Oklahoma in 1954. We have been ignoring it ever since.